Number 1. Tommy Lynn Sells. In the early hours of December 31, 1999, just hours before the new millennium, a drifter slipped into a mobile home in the Guajira Bay subdivision outside Del Rio, Texas. He moved room by room with a cigarette lighter, checking who slept inside. In one bedroom he found what he wanted, 13-year-old Kayleen Katie Harris on the bottom bunk. He lay beside her, covered her mouth, and drew a knife down her body, slicing away her clothing. When she struggled free and screamed for her mother, he slit her throat twice. Then he stabbed her 16 times. 3 of those wounds went completely through her body. Above her, on the top bunk, 10-year-old Crystal Searles had woken. She begged him to leave her alone, promising she would stay quiet. He reached up and cut her throat anyway, severing her windpipe and grazing the sheath of her carotid artery. He left believing both girls were dead. Crystal lay still until she was certain he was gone. Then she got up, blood pouring from the open wound in her neck, and walked nearly a quarter mile in the dark to a neighbor's house. She could not speak. The neighbor opened the door to a child soaked in blood. That walk, and the detailed description she later gave from a hospital bed, ended the long free run of one of America's most prolific traveling killers. Tommy Lynn Sells was born June 28, 1964, in Oakland, California. His twin sister Tammy Jean died of meningitis when the pair were 18 months old. Sells survived. He was sent to live with an aunt for a few years, then returned to his mother. By age 7 he was drinking from his grandfather's stash. By 8 he was being molested by an adult man, something he later claimed his mother encouraged. By 10 he was using drugs and rarely attending school. At 13 he climbed naked into his grandmother's bed. Shortly afterward his mother and siblings left him behind without a forwarding address. From age 14 he lived as a nomad, hopping freights, hitchhiking, stealing cars, working short stints as a carny, mechanic or day laborer, and staying high on alcohol and whatever drugs he could find. He later said the first time he killed felt like the rush of a shot of dope, and he spent the next 2 decades chasing that high across the United States. In July 1985, while working a carnival in Missouri, he met 28-year-old Anna Court and her 4-year-old son Rory. She invited him home. After they had sex he claimed he woke to find her going through his backpack. He took the boy's wooden baseball bat and beat Anna to death, then killed the child so there would be no witness. Their bodies were found 3 days later. Sells was already gone. In November 1987 near Ina, Illinois, the Dardeen family was destroyed. Keith Dardeen, 29, was found in a field, shot in the head, his genitals mutilated. Inside the family's trailer, his pregnant wife Elaine and their 3-year-old son Peter had been beaten to death with a baseball bat. The beating was so severe that Elaine went into labor and delivered a premature daughter. That newborn was also beaten to death. The bodies of mother, son, and infant were found tucked into a bed. Sells confessed to the crime years later, though details of how he first encountered the family shifted in his accounts and local authorities never charged him. He kept moving. A transient named Kent Loughton was stabbed and buried in a shallow grave near a Tucson homeless camp in 1988 after an argument over drugs. In 1991 in Florida, Teresa Hall and her 5-year-old daughter Tiffany were bludgeoned with a table leg after their door was kicked in. In October 1997 near Springfield, Missouri, 13-year-old Stephanie Mahaney was pulled from her bed, injected with cocaine, raped, and strangled. Her body was dumped in a farm pond. That same month in Illinois, 10-year-old Joel Kirkpatrick was stabbed to death in his bedroom while his mother fought the masked intruder. Sells later confessed to that killing as well. In 1992 in Charleston, West Virginia, a woman who had offered him food ended up fighting for her life. He tried to rape her with a kitchen knife. She stabbed him repeatedly, damaging his liver, kidney, and testicle. He smashed a piano stool over her head and left her for dead. She survived. He served 5 years for malicious wounding. Upon release he resumed drifting. By 1999 the killings accelerated and the victims grew younger. In April in Gibson, Tennessee, Deborah Harris was raped and stabbed repeatedly in her bed. Her 8-year-old daughter Ambria was stabbed after witnessing the attack. 2 weeks later in San Antonio during Fiesta, 9-year-old Mary Beatrice Perez disappeared from Market Square. Her body was found a week later in a creek bed. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled with her own t-shirt. Sells later pleaded guilty to her murder and received a life sentence. In May 1999 in Lexington, Kentucky, 13-year-old Haley McCone was raped and strangled. Her body was found days later. Sells sold her bicycle for $20 and got drunk. In July in Kingfisher, Oklahoma, 14-year-old Bobby Lynn Wofford was picked up from a convenience store, sexually assaulted, struck with a hatchet, and shot in the head when she tried to run. He kept 2 of her earrings. Then came the night in Del Rio. Sells had briefly befriended the Harris family through a local church. He knew the father was away. He entered through a window, checked the sleeping children, and chose Katie. After the attack on both girls, he left. Crystal's survival and the sketch she helped produce led police straight to him. He was arrested on January 2, 2000. In the car on the way to the station, he told an officer they had a lot to talk about. Over the following months, he confessed to killing after killing. Investigators ultimately linked him to at least 22 murders across multiple states. He claimed more than 70. Some confessions contained details only the killer could know. Others were vague or inconsistent, and not every claim could be confirmed. What remained clear was a pattern of opportunistic home invasions, sexual violence, and extreme physical brutality directed at women, children, and anyone who happened to be present. In September 2000, a Texas jury convicted him of the capital murder of Kayleen Harris and the attempted murder of Crystal Searles. He was sentenced to death. In 2003, he pleaded guilty to the murder of Mary Beatrice Perez and received a life sentence. He remained on death row at the Polunsky unit until April 3, 2014, when he was executed by lethal injection in Huntsville. Crystal Searles and members of other victims' families were present. Sells once said, "Dead men tell no tales." He spent 20 years trying to make that true. A 10-year-old girl with a severed throat proved him wrong. The bodies he left behind, the families destroyed, and the sheer geographic scale of the violence remain a record of calculated cruelty carried out by a man who treated human lives as disposable obstacles between himself and the next high. Number 2. David Berkowitz. In the summer of 1977, New York City lived in fear of a single man with a .44 caliber bulldog revolver. Young couples parked in cars after late nights out became targets. Women walking home alone became targets. The city that never sleeps started locking its doors earlier, cutting hair shorter, and watching every shadow. The man behind the gun called himself the Son of Sam. He claimed a 6,000-year-old demon spoke through a black Labrador retriever named Harvey, owned by his neighbor Sam Carr, and ordered him to kill. The letters he left behind turned a series of shootings into a citywide nightmare. David Berkowitz was born Richard David Falco on June 1, 1953, in Brooklyn. His unmarried mother placed him for adoption. Pearl and Nathan Berkowitz raised him in the Bronx. He was a difficult child, heavy-set, often bullied. When he was 14, his adoptive mother died of breast cancer. His father later remarried and moved to Florida, leaving the teenage boy behind. Berkowitz enlisted in the army, served in South Korea, and became a skilled marksman. After his discharge in 1974, he drifted through jobs as a taxi driver and postal worker. He later claimed he set more than 1,000 fires across the city in the mid-1970s, keeping a detailed diary of the arsons. His first known attacks came with a knife. On Christmas Eve 1975, he stabbed 2 young women on a bridge in Co-op City. One was 15-year-old Michelle Foreman, who survived multiple wounds. The other woman was never identified. Months later, he began using the revolver that would define him. On the night of July 29, 1976, 18-year-old Donna Loria and her friend Jody Valenti sat in Valenti's double-parked Oldsmobile in the Pelham Bay section of the Bronx after a night of dancing. A man approached the passenger side, raised a .44 caliber handgun and fired. The first bullet struck Loria in the neck and killed her instantly. A second bullet hit Valenti in the thigh. The gunman walked away without a word. Valenti survived. Loria became the first confirmed death attributed to the man who would soon terrorize the city. 3 months later, on October 23, Carl DeNaro and Rosemary Keenan sat in a parked car in Queens. Bullets shattered the windows. DeNaro was struck in the head. Surgeons later replaced part of his shattered skull with a metal plate. Keenan suffered only minor injuries from glass. Both lived. On November 27, 16-year-old Donna DeMazy and 18-year-old Joanne Lomino sat on the porch of Lomino's home in Queens after a late movie. A man in military-style clothing approached, asked for directions in a high-pitched voice, then pulled a revolver and opened fire. DeMazy was hit in the neck. Lomino was shot in the back and left permanently paralyzed from the waist down. The killings continued into 1977. On January 30th, Christine Freund, 26, and her fiancé John Deal sat in his car near the Forest Hills Long Island Railroad station after seeing a movie. 3 shots tore into the vehicle. Freund was hit twice and died. Deal suffered only minor wounds. On March 8th, 19-year-old Barnard College student Virginia Voskerikian walked home from class in Queens. A man stepped from the shadows and shot her in the face. She raised a textbook in a futile attempt to shield herself. The bullet passed through the book and killed her instantly. On April 17, 18-year-old Valentina Suriani and her boyfriend Alexander Esau, 20, sat in her car in the Bronx, only blocks from where Donna Loria had been murdered. The gunman fired through the window. Both were shot in the head. Suriani died at the scene. Esau reached the hospital but did not survive. Near their bodies, police found a handwritten letter addressed to Captain Joseph Borelli of the NYPD. In it, the killer introduced himself as the son of Sam, claimed a demonic father named Sam lived inside a black dog, and wrote that he lived for the blood of young women. The letter mocked the police and promised more deaths. From that moment, the city knew the name of its predator. The panic intensified. Newspapers published composite sketches. Women cut their long hair or dyed it. Discotheques emptied early. On June 26, Judy Placido and Salvatore Lupo were shot as they sat in a car in Bayside, Queens, after leaving a disco. Both were wounded but survived. Placido was hit in the temple, shoulder, and neck. Lupo was struck in the forearm. They had been discussing the son of Sam only moments before the gunfire. The final attack came in the early hours of July 31, 1977. 20-year-old Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante sat kissing in a parked car in the Bath Beach section of Brooklyn on their first date. A man walked up to the passenger window and fired. Moskowitz was struck in the head and died hours later in the hospital. Violante was hit in the face. He lost his left eye and much of the vision in his right. A witness walking her dog that night noticed a yellow Ford Galaxy receiving a parking ticket near the scene. That single ticket became the break. Detectives traced the car to a postal worker named David Berkowitz living at 35 Pine Street in Yonkers. Neighbors had already complained that Berkowitz had shot their dog and sent threatening letters. On August 10, 1977, police found the yellow Ford outside the building. Inside the car they saw a rifle and a duffel bag containing ammunition and maps. When Berkowitz walked out and got behind the wheel, officers surrounded him. He smiled and said, "Well, you got me. What took you so long?" On the seat beside him was a paper bag holding the .44 caliber Bulldog revolver used in every shooting. Extra bullets were in his pocket. In custody, Berkowitz confessed to all the attacks. He claimed the demon speaking through Sam Carr's dog Harvey had commanded him to kill. He said the dog howled instructions and that he had no choice. He also admitted to setting more than 1,000 fires. Later he would claim the demon's story was a lie, that he killed out of rage and a desire to be noticed. Still later he claimed involvement in a satanic cult and suggested others had participated in some of the shootings. Investigators found no credible evidence supporting the cult claims. On May 8, 1978, Berkowitz pleaded guilty to 6 murders and 7 attempted murders. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive terms of 25 years to life. In court he attempted to leap from a window, shouting that one of the victims had been a whore and that he would kill again. He has remained in prison ever since, currently at Shangum Correctional Facility. He has been denied parole repeatedly. In later years he converted to evangelical Christianity and began calling himself the Son of Hope, expressing remorse and stating he deserves to stay locked away. 6 young people never came home. Others lived with permanent paralysis, lost eyesight, and shattered skulls. An entire city spent a year looking over its shoulder because one man decided that the blood of strangers would make him matter. The letters, the dog, the demons, all of it was the language of a killer who wanted the world to watch while he destroyed lives that had nothing to do with him. Number 3. H. Holmes. In the shadow of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, while the White City dazzled visitors with electric lights and grand pavilions, a different structure rose on the city's south side. Locals called it the Castle. Its owner, a smooth-talking pharmacist who went by H. Holmes, filled it with shops on the ground floor, rented rooms above, and according to the legend that grew after his arrest, a private architecture of death. Soundproof chambers. Trapdoors. Gas lines that could be controlled from a hidden panel. Chutes leading to a basement where acid vats, a kiln, and dissection tools waited. Whether every detail of that legend holds up under modern scrutiny or not, the man at the center of it remains one of America's first documented serial killers. A charming con artist who murdered for money, convenience, and the elimination of witnesses. He was born Herman Webster Mudgett on May 16, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. As a boy he was intelligent and restless. In medical school he developed a habit of stealing cadavers, disfiguring them, and collecting insurance money by staging accidents. He married, abandoned his first wife and child, and drifted west under new names. By the mid-1880s he had settled in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago, taken over a pharmacy after the previous owner vanished, and begun constructing a 3-story building across the street. He told people the upper floors would become a hotel for the coming World's Fair. Workers later described a confusing layout of angled corridors, doors that opened onto blank walls, staircases that led nowhere, and rooms that could be locked from the outside. Some spaces were windowless. Others had gas fixtures. A chute ran toward the basement. After Holmes's arrest, newspapers turned every odd architectural choice into a chamber of horrors. Historians today note that many of the most lurid claims, dozens of elaborate gas chambers, daily streams of anonymous fair visitors vanishing into ovens, were exaggerated by the yellow press of the 1890s. What is not in dispute is that people who entered Holmes's orbit tended to disappear, and that he benefited financially every time they did. One of the earliest was Julia Connor. She and her husband worked in Holmes's building. When Julia began an affair with Holmes, her husband left. Julia and her young daughter Pearl remained. Around Christmas 1891 both vanished. Holmes later claimed Julia had died during an abortion he performed. No bodies were ever positively identified, but investigators believed he killed them. Around the same period, a young woman named Emmeline Sigrand, who had worked as his secretary and accepted his proposal of marriage, also disappeared. Holmes told different stories. She had run off with another man or died in another medical mishap. A heavy trunk was carried to the basement around the time she vanished. Later, a fully articulated female skeleton was sold to a medical school. Items linked to other missing women, including sisters Minnie and Nanny Williams, were recovered from the building's ovens and rooms. Minnie had transferred property and money to Holmes before she and her sister vanished in 1893. Their bodies were never found. Holmes's most thoroughly documented crimes came after the fair closed. He had taken out a life insurance policy on his associate Benjamin Pittazel, a petty criminal who helped him with frauds. In 1894, Holmes knocked Pittazel unconscious in a Philadelphia house, arranged the scene to look like an accidental explosion, and set the body on fire. He collected the insurance money. Then, to keep the truth buried, he took 3 of Pittazel's children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, under the pretense of reuniting them with their father. He traveled with them by train, moving from city to city. In Indianapolis, he killed 8-year-old Howard, burned the body in a stove, and left teeth and bone fragments that were later recovered. In Toronto, he locked the 2 girls in a trunk and asphyxiated them with gas or chloroform. Their naked bodies were found in a cellar. Holmes had systematically eliminated an entire family to protect a fraud. Arrest came in Boston in November 1894. Pinkerton detectives, insurance investigators, and a tip from a former cellmate who knew about the Pittazel scheme closed in. Holmes was first held on a Texas horse theft warrant, then extradited to Philadelphia to stand trial for Pittazel's murder. While awaiting trial, he sold confessions to newspapers, claiming 27 victims, then more than 100. Several of the people he named turned out to be still alive. Modern researchers, working from court records and contemporary investigations, placed the credible number at roughly 9. That number is still horrific. The methods were practical and cold: poison, chloroform, fire, asphyxiation, and the quiet disposal of remains so that insurance claims could be collected and questions would stop. On May 7, 1896, at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia, H. Holmes was hanged. He ate eggs, dry toast, and coffee for breakfast. On the scaffold, he declared he had killed only 2 people. The trap dropped. It took more than 15 minutes for his heart to stop. He had requested that his body be buried in cement so that no one could dig it up for study or spectacle. The request was granted. The castle itself was later stripped, remodeled, and eventually destroyed by fire. The legend of a labyrinthine death hotel that swallowed hundreds of World's Fair visitors grew larger than the evidence. What remains solid is the pattern of a man who treated human beings as obstacles and sources of cash. He charmed women out of their savings and their lives. He burned a business partner and then murdered the man's children so the secret would stay buried. He sold skeletons and collected insurance on the dead. America's first famous modern serial killer did not need a fairy tale dungeon of trapdoors and gas chambers to be monstrous. He needed only opportunity, a plausible smile, and the willingness to erase anyone who stood between him and the next payment. Number 4. Albert Fish. In November 1934, a handwritten letter arrived at a Manhattan apartment on West 15th Street. It was addressed to the mother of a 10-year-old girl who had been missing for more than 6 years. The letter began with a strange story about a sailor who developed a taste for human flesh during a famine in China. Then it turned to the writer's own actions. He described how he had visited the family in 1928 under a false name, brought strawberries and pot cheese, and left with their daughter under the pretext of taking her to a children's birthday party. He wrote that he had stripped her, strangled her, cut her into pieces, cooked the flesh with onions and carrots, and eaten her body over 9 days. The letter ended with the claim that she had died a virgin. The stationery carried a distinctive emblem. Detective William King traced it to a rooming house. On December 13, 1934, police arrested a frail, gray-haired house painter named Hamilton Howard Fish, known as Albert. He was 64 years old. When confronted, he confessed. The letter that had been meant to inflict fresh agony on a grieving family became the evidence that ended his freedom. Albert Fish was born on May 19, 1870 in Washington, D.C. His father, already elderly, died when the boy was 5. His mother, unable to care for the children, placed him in St. John's Orphanage. There he was regularly beaten. He later said the place ruined his mind. The pain of the floggings became linked in his mind with pleasure. He began wetting the bed, stammering and running away. When his mother eventually reclaimed him, the patterns were already set. He left school early, worked odd jobs, and drifted to New York in the 1890s as a house painter. He married, fathered 6 children, and presented himself as an ordinary working man. His wife left him in 1917. Behind the quiet exterior, he practiced extreme self-torture and preyed on children. Fish targeted the vulnerable, children from poor families, those left unsupervised, boys and girls he could lure with offers of money or treats. He traveled for work and claimed to have committed acts in multiple states. Prosecutors and later investigators accepted 3 murders as confirmed by confession and physical evidence. On July 14, 1924, 8-year-old Francis McDonald disappeared from Port Richmond on Staten Island while playing. His body was found the next day in the woods, strangled and mutilated. Witnesses described a tall, gray-haired man in the area. Years later, Fish admitted he was that man. He had lured the boy, assaulted him, and killed him. On February 11, 1927, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney vanished from the hallway of a Brooklyn apartment building while playing with another small child. The surviving boy later said the boogeyman had taken Billy. Fish confessed in a letter written after his arrest. He described taking the crying child to an empty house near the Riker Avenue dumps. He stripped him, tied him, gagged him with a rag from the dump, and burned his clothes. The next day he returned with a homemade cat-o'-nine-tails and whipped the boy until blood ran. He cut off the child's ears and nose, slit his mouth, gouged out his eyes, and drank his blood from the wound in his belly. He dismembered the body, scattered parts, and cooked in 8 portions. He wrote that no roast turkey had ever tasted half as good. The crime that finally exposed him was the murder of Grace Budd. On May 28, 1928, Fish answered a classified advertisement placed by 18-year-old Edward Budd, who was seeking farm work. Fish presented himself as Frank Howard, a prosperous farmer from Long Island. He visited the family's apartment, brought food, and won their trust. On June 3, he returned and asked if Grace could accompany him to a birthday party for his sister's children. The parents agreed. Grace never came home. Fish took her by train and trolley to an abandoned house he had selected in advance, Wisteria Cottage in Irvington, New York. He told her to gather wildflowers while he went inside. When she entered the bedroom and saw him naked, she screamed and tried to run. He seized her by the throat and strangled her. He was sexually aroused by the act of killing her. He then decapitated her, catching blood in a paint can that he later threw into the yard. He dismembered the body with a handsaw, butcher knife, and cleaver. He carried portions wrapped in newspaper back to his rooms in the city, cooked them, and ate them over the following days. The remaining bones he scattered behind a stone wall at the property. 6 years later, the letter to her mother brought detectives to the site. Grace's skull and other bones were recovered exactly where he said they would be. After his arrest, X-rays of Fish's body revealed at least 29 sewing needles he had inserted into his own groin and abdomen over many years. He had driven them in so deeply that they could not be removed. The self-mutilation was part of a long pattern of sadomasochistic practices that included flagellation with nail-studded paddles and other forms of deliberate pain. Psychiatrists who examined him documented religious delusions mixed with these paraphilias. He claimed God had commanded him to torment and sacrifice children. He quoted twisted biblical passages about dashing little ones against stones. At trial in White Plains in March 1935, the defense argued insanity. The prosecution maintained that however abnormal Fish was, he knew the nature and wrongfulness of his acts. The jury found him sane and guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Grace Budd. Some jurors later indicated they believed him insane but wanted him executed. Sentence of death was automatic. On the night of January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was electrocuted at Sing Sing prison. He was 65. He entered the chair calmly. Witnesses reported that the first jolt did not kill him immediately because of the metal needles in his body. A second current was required. He was pronounced dead at 11:06 p.m. Fish claimed at various times to have assaulted or killed around 100 children. Contemporary investigators treated the higher figures as exaggeration. What is established is the systematic predation on children, the prolonged torture, the cannibalism, and the calculated cruelty of writing to a mother years later to describe exactly how her daughter had been killed and eaten. The Gray Man, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Werewolf of Wisteria, whatever name the newspapers gave him, was a slight, unremarkable figure who moved through the city for decades while inflicting suffering that still stands among the most extreme in the record of American crime. 3 children are confirmed dead by his hand. The full number of those he harmed will never be known. Number 5. Harold Shipman, Dr. Death. For more than 20 years, patients in the towns of Todmorden and Hyde trusted the man they called Dr. Fred. Harold Shipman was the family doctor who made house calls, spoke gently to the elderly and seemed to care. Behind that carefully maintained image he was killing them. He injected lethal doses of diamorphine, the medical form of heroin, into people who had come to him for help, then forged their medical records to make the deaths look natural. An official public inquiry later concluded he murdered at least 215 of his patients. Some estimates place the true number closer to 250. He is the only doctor in British history convicted of murdering those under his care, and one of the most prolific serial killers ever recorded. Harold Frederick Shipman was born on January 14, 1946 in Nottingham. He grew up on a council estate, the middle child of a working-class family. His mother Vera was the dominant figure in his early life and instilled in him a sense of superiority. When he was 17 she died of lung cancer. He watched doctors ease her suffering with morphine in her final days. The experience left a deep mark. 2 years later he entered medical school at the University of Leeds. He married Primrose Oxtoby while still a student. She was pregnant with their first child. He qualified in 1970 and began hospital work before moving into general practice. In 1974 he joined a practice in Todmorden in West Yorkshire. Within months colleagues discovered he had been forging prescriptions for the painkiller pethidine for his own use. He was convicted of drug offenses and forgery in 1976, fined, and ordered into rehabilitation. The General Medical Council allowed him to continue practicing. That decision would prove catastrophic. After a period of recovery he moved to Hyde in Greater Manchester and joined the Donnybrook practice. In 1992 he set up as a single-handed general practitioner on Market Street. Alone in his own surgery with no partners to question his decisions, the killings accelerated. Shipman's method was consistent and calculated. He targeted mostly elderly women living alone, though he also killed men and on occasion younger patients. He would visit them at home, often on the pretext of a routine check or to treat a minor complaint. He carried diamorphine obtained through false prescriptions written in the names of dying patients or by other deceptive means. He injected a lethal dose, stayed long enough to watch the victim die or left and returned later to discover the body, then filled out a death certificate citing natural causes, heart failure, old age, stroke. He altered computer records after the fact to create a false history of declining health. In some cases he took small items of jewelry from the houses. In a few he altered wills so that he, rather than the family, would inherit. The first killing the inquiry could establish with confidence was that of Eva Lyons in March 1975, while Shipman was still in Todmorden. Over the following decades the deaths mounted. At the Donnybrook practice he killed around 70 patients. Once he was working alone on Market Street the rate rose sharply. 30 in 1995, 30 in 1996, 37 in 1997. In the first months of 1998 he killed 15 more before a pause, then 3 final victims. The majority of the 215 confirmed victims were women. The oldest was 93. The youngest unexpected death was a 47-year-old man. Most appeared healthy or only mildly unwell when Shipman arrived. Families later described finding their relatives fully clothed, sitting in a chair or lying on a settee, as if they had simply fallen asleep. Local undertakers noticed that an unusually high number of Shipman's patients died at home and in similar positions. A fellow doctor raised concerns about the death rate. In 1998 police conducted a limited investigation but found nothing they considered strong enough to act on. Shipman continued killing. The case that finally exposed him was the death of Kathleen Grundy on June 24, 1998. Mrs. Grundy was 81, a former mayoress of Hyde, active, independent and in good health. Shipman visited her that morning. Later the same day she was found dead. Shipman certified the cause as old age. A few days later her daughter, Angela Woodruff, a solicitor, received a copy of a will that left her mother's entire estate, valued at around £386,000, to Shipman. The will was poorly typed and the signature did not match her mother's known handwriting. Woodruff went to the police. Officers exhumed Kathleen Grundy's body. Toxicology revealed a fatal level of diamorphine. Shipman's computer records showed he had entered notes suggesting Mrs. Grundy was a drug addict. Entries created after her death. A search of his home found the typewriter used to forge the will and jewelry belonging to other patients. On September 7, 1998, Harold Shipman was arrested. He was charged with the murders of 15 women killed between 1995 and 1998. Marie West, Irene Turner, Lizzie Adams, Jean Lilly, Ivy Lomas, Muriel Grimshaw, Marie Quinn, Kathleen Wagstaff, Bianca Pomfret, Nora Nuttall, Pamela Hillier, Maureen Ward, Winifred Meller, Joan Melia, and Kathleen Grundy. The trial began at Preston Crown Court in October 1999. The evidence was meticulous. Altered computer timestamps, the presence of diamorphine in the bodies, the forged will, the pattern of sudden deaths after Shipman's visits. On January 31, 2000, the jury convicted him on all 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. The judge imposed 15 life sentences with a whole life tariff, meaning he would never be released. The judge told him the sheer wickedness of what he had done defied description. A public inquiry led by Dame Janet Smith then examined hundreds of deaths certified by Shipman. In 2002, the first report concluded he had killed 215 patients between 1975 and 1998. A further 45 deaths were considered suspicious. The inquiry exposed systemic failures: the ease with which a single doctor could obtain and stockpile controlled drugs, the absence of proper scrutiny of death certificates, the lack of effective monitoring of unusually high death rates in a practice. Reforms followed in the certification of deaths, the regulation of controlled drugs, and the oversight of general practitioners. Shipman never admitted the killings. He maintained his innocence until the end. On the morning of January 13, 2004, the day before his 58th birthday, he was found hanging in his cell at Wakefield Prison. He had used bed sheets tied to the window bars. An inquest concluded he took his own life, partly from despair at the prospect of spending the rest of his days in prison and partly to protect his wife's financial position regarding his pension. The families of his victims were left without the answers they needed. Many said they felt cheated by his suicide. The man who had sat in their living rooms, spoken kindly to their parents and grandparents, and then ended those lives with a syringe took the full truth with him. What remains is the record of systematic betrayal. A doctor who turned the trust placed in him into a license to kill, who chose the most vulnerable, who covered his tracks with the very authority of his profession, and who continued for more than 2 decades while the systems meant to protect patients failed to stop him. Harold Shipman murdered in the quiet of ordinary homes, one injection at a time, until the scale of the deaths could no longer be ignored. Number 6. Pedro Lopez. In the late 1970s, young girls began disappearing from markets and streets across Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. Many came from poor families or indigenous communities. Their absences were often dismissed at first. Runaways, the authorities said, or children who had simply wandered off. Then in 1980, a flash flood near Ambato, Ecuador, washed away soil and exposed human remains. The bodies of girls, most between the ages of 8 and 12, lay in shallow graves. When police followed the trail, they arrested a soft-spoken Colombian man named Pedro Alonso Lopez. He calmly led them to more burial sites and confessed to killing more than 100 girls in Ecuador alone. He claimed the true number across 3 countries exceeded 300. The newspapers named him the Monster of the Andes. He is considered one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history, and after serving a fraction of the time his crimes warranted, he vanished. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born on October 8, 1948 in the Tolima region of Colombia, the 7th of 13 children. His father had been killed months before his birth during the violent period known as La Violencia. His mother, Benilda, worked as a prostitute and laundry worker in extreme poverty. The family lived in a single room where the children could hear their mother's clients. Lopez later described a childhood of beatings and emotional cruelty. At around the age of 8, according to his own account, his mother caught him touching one of his younger sisters and threw him out of the house. He lived on the streets of Bogotá among other homeless children. An older man offered him food and shelter, then raped him. Lopez later said that experience destroyed whatever innocence he had left. He claimed he decided then that he would do the same to as many girls as he could. As a teenager he drifted, stole, and eventually landed in prison in Colombia for car theft. Inside he was raped by other inmates. He later killed some of those men. The authorities treated the killings as self-defense and added only a short extension to his sentence. When he was released in the late 1970s, he began the systematic predation that would define him. Lopez targeted girls who appeared trusting and alone, children in markets, near schools, or on the edges of towns. He approached them in daylight, offered sweets, money, or the promise of work, and led them away from safety. He preferred open country or remote mountain paths where no one would hear them. Once isolated, he raped them. He waited for sunrise. Then he placed his hands around their throats and strangled them while looking into their eyes. He later explained that he needed daylight so he could watch the light go out of their faces. Darkness, he said, would have been a waste. After they were dead, he sometimes violated the bodies again. He buried them in groups of 3 or 4 in shallow graves, covering them with dirt, branches, or newspaper. On later visits he claimed he would dig them up, arrange the remains, and hold what he called tea parties with his little dolls. He moved between countries to avoid detection. In Peru he focused on indigenous communities in the Andes, where missing children were less likely to trigger large investigations. He claimed more than 100 victims there. In Colombia he admitted to at least another 100. In Ecuador the numbers were better documented. By 1980 he was living in the Ambato area and continuing the same pattern. Local people had begun to notice the disappearances. A flash flood exposed several of the graves and forced the police to act more aggressively. In March 1980 Lopez attempted to abduct a 12-year-old girl named Marie from a market in Ambato. Her mother intervened and raised the alarm. A shopkeeper and others restrained him until police arrived. At first he said little. Investigators, aware of his Catholic background, arranged for a priest to speak with him. After that conversation Lopez began to talk. He described the rapes and the strangulations in detail. He remembered the locations of the graves with precision. Skeptical officers challenged him. In response he led them into the countryside and pointed to spot after spot. Over the following days and weeks they recovered the remains of at least 53 girls, most aged between 8 and 13. Some reports placed the number of recovered bodies higher. Only a minority could be identified. Lopez insisted the true figure in Ecuador alone was 110. Police accepted that number for the purposes of the charges. He was charged with the rape and murder of 110 girls. In July 1981 he pleaded guilty to 57 of the counts. Under Ecuadorian law at the time, the maximum prison sentence for even multiple murders was 16 years. The public reaction was furious. Families of the missing and the dead saw a man who had destroyed scores of children's lives receive what amounted to a little more than a decade behind bars. Lopez himself seemed unconcerned. He called himself the man of the century and said people would never forget his name. He served roughly 14 years, much of it in solitary confinement, and was released in the mid-1990s for good behavior. Ecuador deported him to Colombia. There he faced outstanding warrants. A court declared him insane and sent him to a psychiatric hospital. In 1998 or 1999 he was judged competent, posted a minimal bail, reports put it at around $50, and walked free under the condition that he continue psychiatric treatment. He never did. He disappeared. Interpol has listed him. Occasional unsolved killings of young girls in Colombia have been compared to his methods, but nothing has been proven. As of the most recent public information, Pedro Alonso Lopez's whereabouts remain unknown. He may be dead. He may still be alive and free. The girls he killed were children who trusted a stranger offering kindness. They were taken from markets and paths, raped, strangled in daylight so their killer could watch them die, and buried in the earth of 3 countries. Their families searched for years. Many never recovered a body that could be named. The legal systems that finally caught Lopez then released him after a fraction of the time his crimes deserved. The monster of the Andes remains one of the starkest examples of a predator who operated across borders with near impunity, and of a justice system that failed the children he destroyed. Number 7. Samuel Little. For more than 3 decades the bodies of women turned up in alleys, vacant lots, dumpsters along rural roads, and in abandoned buildings across the United States. Many of the deaths were written off as drug overdoses, exposure, or undetermined causes. There were rarely stab wounds or gunshot trauma. The real cause was a pair of large, powerful hands and a man who had once trained as a boxer. In 2018, while already serving consecutive life sentences, that man began to talk in detail. Samuel Little confessed to 93 murders committed between 1970 and 2005. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program has confirmed his involvement in at least 60 of them, the highest number of confirmed victims for any serial killer in United States history. He also produced precise color portraits and sketches from memory of dozens of the women he killed. Those drawings remain among the most haunting artifacts in modern American true crime, faces rendered decades later by the man who ended their lives. Samuel Little was born Samuel McDowell on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia. His mother was a teenager. He later claimed she worked as a prostitute and abandoned him soon after birth. He was raised primarily by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio. School did not hold him. He dropped out and by his mid-teens was already in the juvenile system for theft. From the late 1950s onward he drifted from state to state with no fixed home and no legitimate long-term employment. The arrest record grew long and varied: breaking and entering, shoplifting, fraud, driving under the influence, assault, armed robbery, solicitation of prostitution, rape, and aggravated assault on police officers. By 1975 he had been arrested more than 24 times in 11 different states. He served relatively short stretches of time and was repeatedly released back onto the streets. During one period of incarceration he took up boxing and later referred to himself as a former prize fighter. The skills he developed, speed, balance, and crushing power in the hands and arms, became the tools of his murders. Little's preferred method was consistent across decades and states. He sought out women who were isolated, intoxicated, or living on the margins, often sex workers, drug users, or transients whose disappearances were less likely to trigger immediate, well-resourced investigations. He offered rides, alcohol, or drugs. Once alone with them, frequently in a car or a secluded outdoor location, he used a sudden punch or series of blows to the head or face to render them unconscious. Then he strangled them with his bare hands. In many cases he became sexually aroused during the act of choking them. Because there were rarely knives or guns involved, and because the bodies were often found after decomposition had begun, medical examiners and local police frequently classified the deaths as overdoses, accidental, or undetermined. Little later told investigators he believed no one was keeping score of these women. For a long time the system proved him right. He moved constantly, crossing state lines and changing cities whenever attention threatened to focus on him. Confirmed and confessed killings stretch from Florida and Georgia through the Midwest and into California, Texas, Ohio, Louisiana, and beyond, 19 states in total. He avoided the kind of signature that might have linked cases in an era before widespread DNA databases and national crime information systems. When he was arrested in connection with violent crimes, including attempted murders and sexual assaults, charges sometimes collapsed for lack of evidence, witnesses who disappeared, or prosecutorial decisions that treated the cases as isolated incidents. In 1982 he faced a murder charge in Mississippi related to the death of 22-year-old Melinda LaPree. He was not convicted. Similar near misses occurred in other jurisdictions. Each release allowed the pattern to continue. The breakthrough that finally stopped him came in 2012. Little was living in a homeless shelter in Kentucky when authorities located him on an outstanding narcotics warrant from Los Angeles. Once in California custody, detectives obtained a DNA sample. It matched biological evidence recovered from 3 unsolved strangulation murders of women in Los Angeles County between 1987 and 1989. The victims had been beaten and then manually strangled. Their bodies were dumped in an alley, a parking garage, and a dumpster. In September 2014 a jury convicted Little of those 3 murders. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. At the time, investigators already suspected he was responsible for additional deaths, but the full scale of his crimes remained hidden behind decades of misclassified cases and fragmented local investigations. That scale became visible only in 2018. A Texas Ranger named James Holland began a series of interviews with Little that would eventually total more than 700 hours. Little, then in his late 70s and confined for life, started describing killings with granular precision: locations, the appearance of the women, the sequence of events, the weather, even small details of clothing or jewelry. He claimed 93 murders. Crime analysts from the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program worked systematically to match the confessions against cold case files, unidentified remains, and historical death records. Little's memory for faces proved extraordinary. With art supplies provided in prison he produced color portraits and sketches of many of the victims he had killed decades earlier. The drawings were released publicly in the hope that someone would recognize a sister, a daughter, a mother, or a friend. Some matches were made. Others remain unidentified to this day. By late 2019, the FBI publicly stated that Samuel Little was the most prolific serial killer in United States history by number of confirmed victims. More than 50 of his confessions had been verified through DNA evidence, corroborating details, or other investigative means. The confirmed total later rose above 60. Additional cases continued to be reviewed after his death. Little pleaded guilty to further murders in Ohio and other jurisdictions, adding to his formal convictions, but the majority of the confirmed cases never reached a courtroom because he was already serving life without parole and prosecutors saw little practical value in additional trials. Throughout the interviews, Little showed little conventional remorse. At times he framed the killings as a twisted form of mercy or as a compulsion he compared to a drug high. He described the act of strangulation as something that gave him a sense of power and release. What the verified record shows is a man who spent decades exploiting the vulnerability of women whom society too often overlooked, who used physical strength developed in prison gyms to end lives, and who left behind a trail of misclassified deaths that only began to be corrected when he himself decided to speak. Samuel Little died in custody on December 30, 2020, at the age of 80. He took with him whatever remaining details he had never shared. The portraits he drew still exist in investigative files. Some of the faces now have names and closed cases. Many still do not. For those families, the work of matching confession to remains continues. An unfinished accounting for the women Samuel Little believed no one would ever count, and a lasting reminder of how easily a predator can operate when the victims are the people society is least inclined to protect. Number 8. Edmund Kemper. On April 23, 1973, Santa Cruz police received a series of phone calls from a man claiming to be their acquaintance, Big Ed. He was calling from a phone booth in Pueblo, Colorado. He told them he had murdered his mother and her best friend 4 days earlier, and that the bodies were still in the house on Ord Drive. The officers who knew him from the local bar, the jury room, initially thought it was a grotesque joke. Big Ed was the tall, soft-spoken, intelligent regular who bought rounds and listened to their stories. It took repeated calls and mounting detail before they believed him. When they entered the house, they found exactly what he had described. Clarnell Strandberg's headless body was in a closet. Her friend Sally Hallett had been killed and left in another room. Both had been decapitated. Edmund Emil Kemper III, 6 feet 9 inches tall with a measured IQ of 136, had ended an 11-month killing spree by destroying the person he had hated most of his life, then driven across state lines and turned himself in. Kemper was born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California. He was the middle child and only son of Clarnell Elizabeth Strandberg and Edmund Emil Kemper Jr. From early childhood he was unusually large. By the age of 4 he already towered over other children. His parents' marriage was violent and unstable. Clarnell was described by those who knew her as domineering, alcoholic, and emotionally abusive. After the divorce in 1957 she moved with the children to Montana. Kemper later said she locked him in the basement at night, claiming she feared he would harm his sisters, and that she constantly told him no woman would ever want him. He killed family cats, burying one alive before later digging it up and decapitating it. He beheaded his sister's dolls. At 14 he ran away to find his father. When that failed, he was sent to live with his paternal grandparents on their ranch in North Fork, California. On August 27, 1964, 15-year-old Edmund Kemper shot his grandmother Maud as she sat at the kitchen table. He then waited for his grandfather to return from errands and shot him as well. He called his mother afterward and, on her advice, contacted the sheriff. He told authorities he had wanted to know what it felt like to kill. Diagnosed at the time with paranoid schizophrenia, he was committed to Atascadero State Hospital. There his IQ was measured at 136 and later at 145. Staff found him intelligent, cooperative, and introspective. In 1969, at age 21, he was released on parole into his mother's custody in Santa Cruz. His juvenile record was eventually sealed. He attempted to join the police force but was rejected because of his height. He took menial jobs, including work for the California Highway Department, and began frequenting the jury room, a bar popular with local officers. He became a familiar, polite presence among them. At the same time he began picking up female hitchhikers. At first he let them go. Then, on May 7, 1972, he picked up 2 18-year-old Fresno State students, Mary and Pesci and Anita Lucchesa, near Berkeley. They believed they were getting a ride toward Stanford. Instead he drove them to a remote wooded area. He handcuffed Pesci, forced Lucchesa into the trunk, and killed both women by stabbing and strangling. He later said the struggle with Pesci was prolonged and difficult. He put their bodies in the trunk of his car and drove home. On the way he was stopped by a police officer for a broken taillight. The officer did not open the trunk. At his apartment, Kemper photographed the bodies, engaged in sexual acts with the corpses, then decapitated and dismembered them. He disposed of the remains in separate locations in the mountains. Pesci's head was later found. Lucchesa's remains were never recovered. 4 months later, on September 14, 1972, 15-year-old Aiko Ku was hitchhiking to a dance class when Kemper offered her a ride. He killed her, brought her body home while his mother was at work, and again performed necrophilic acts before dismembering her. He kept her head for several days. On January 7, 1973, he picked up 19-year-old Cabrillo College student Cindy Shaw, shot her, and repeated the same sequence of post-mortem sexual acts and dismemberment. He buried her head in the backyard of his mother's house, facing his bedroom window so he could talk to it. On February 5, 1973, using a university parking sticker his mother had obtained through her job at UC Santa Cruz, Kemper drove onto campus and picked up 2 students, 23-year-old Rosalind Thorpe and 20-year-old Alice Liu. He shot both women in the car, then drove past campus security with their dying bodies inside. At home he beheaded them in the vehicle, carried the headless corpses inside, engaged in necrophilia, and later discarded the remains after removing bullets to hinder identification. Throughout this period, Kemper continued living with his mother and continued socializing with police officers at the jury room. He listened to their conversations about the missing co-eds and the investigation. The officers had no idea the man buying them drinks was the killer they were hunting. The final murders occurred over Easter weekend 1973. On the night of April 20th, after an argument, Kemper waited until his mother was asleep. He bludgeoned her in the head with a claw hammer, then cut her throat. He decapitated her, engaged in sexual acts with the head, and placed it on the mantel. He later said he threw darts at it. He removed her larynx and tongue and put them in the garbage disposal. The disposal jammed and spat them back out. The next day he invited his mother's close friend, 59-year-old Sarah Sally Hallett, to the house for dinner and a movie. When she arrived he killed her as well, beating and strangling her, then decapitating her. He left both bodies in the house, drove out of California, and eventually called the police from Colorado to confess. Kemper led investigators to remaining body parts and gave detailed, unemotional accounts of every murder. He was charged with 8 counts of murder for the co-ed killings, his mother and Hallett. The earlier murders of his grandparents were already on record. At trial he was found sane and guilty. He requested the death penalty. Because capital punishment was then under a legal suspension in California, he received 8 concurrent life sentences. He has remained incarcerated ever since, primarily at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. Edmund Kemper stands 6 feet 9 inches tall. He is articulate, has a high IQ, and has given extensive interviews over the decades. He has described the killings as driven by rage toward his mother and by a need for total possession of his victims once they were dead. The women he murdered were hitchhikers and students who accepted a ride from a soft-spoken giant who seemed harmless. Their bodies were taken apart in the house he shared with the woman he hated. While he was doing it he drank with the police who were searching for him. When he was finished he simply picked up a phone and told them where to look. Number 9. Alexander Pichushkin. In the dense woods of Moscow's Bitsa Park, between 2001 and 2006, bodies kept turning up in sewage wells and under the trees. Most of the dead were older men, many of them homeless or heavy drinkers, people whose disappearances rarely triggered urgent investigations. Some had been beaten so savagely that their skulls were shattered. In several cases an empty vodka bottle had been forced into the wound. Locals began speaking of a Bitsa Park maniac. When police finally arrested a soft-spoken supermarket shelf-stacker named Alexander Yuryevich Pichushkin in June 2006, he led them through the park and pointed out grave after grave. He claimed he had been trying to fill every square on a chessboard, 64 victims. Investigators confirmed 49 murders and 3 attempted murders. Pichushkin himself insisted the true total was closer to 60. During his trial he sat inside a reinforced glass cage, the same protective measure once used for Andrei Chikatilo, while the public raged outside. Pichushkin was born on April 9, 1974 in Mytishi, on the outskirts of Moscow. As a young child he was described as outgoing. That changed after a playground accident. He fell backward off a swing and the seat struck him hard in the forehead. Specialists later speculated that the blow may have damaged the frontal cortex, the area of the brain associated with impulse control and aggression. His behavior grew hostile and unpredictable. He was bullied at school and transferred to a facility for children with learning difficulties. His maternal grandfather recognized that the boy was intelligent and took him in. The grandfather taught him chess. Pechushkin proved talented. He began playing exhibition games against older men in Bitsa Park, channeling aggression into the board. When his grandfather died, the emotional support and the structured outlet disappeared. Pechushkin returned to living with his mother, drifted into heavy drinking, and the idea of real domination began to replace the game. His first known murder occurred on July 27, 1992, when he was 18. He arranged to meet a classmate, Mikhail Odichuk, in Bitsa Park. According to Pechushkin's later account, the two had discussed a plan to kill 64 people, one for each square on a chessboard. When Odichuk changed his mind and refused to take part, Pechushkin killed him. He strangled the young man and dumped the body into a sewage well. Police questioned him about the disappearance but accepted his denials. The case went nowhere. Pechushkin later said the experience taught him he could kill with near impunity. For nearly a decade he appears to have remained largely quiet. Then in May 2001, the killings resumed in earnest and never truly stopped until his arrest. The method was simple and effective. Pechushkin would approach men in or near Bitsa Park, often elderly, often lonely, frequently acquaintances from the chess tables or neighbors from his apartment block, and invite them for a drink. A common pretext was that he wanted company while mourning his dead dog. He would lead them to a quiet spot near a sewer shaft or deep in the trees and produce a bottle of vodka. Once the victim was intoxicated and off guard, Pechushkin struck from behind with a hammer, a metal pipe, a log, or the bottle itself. Early on he frequently pushed still living victims into the sewage wells, where they drowned or died of injuries and exposure. Later, especially from late 2005 onward, he beat them more savagely and sometimes forced the empty vodka bottle into the shattered skull as a kind of signature. He later told investigators that killing people he knew gave him a stronger emotional charge than killing strangers. Between May 2001 and September 2005 he attacked at least 36 people. 3 survived. The pace accelerated. In 1 month alone he killed 6. Bodies were recovered from the park's sewage system over the years. Sewage workers repeatedly reported human remains washing through the pipes, but the cases were often treated as isolated or accidental. Many of the victims had no close family pressing for answers. The park itself was large and wooded. A missing alcoholic or pensioner did not always generate a major manhunt. Pechushkin continued working his ordinary job, living with his mother, and returning to the same hunting ground. The end came through a mistake of his own making. In June 2006 he invited a 36-year-old co-worker, Marina Mosklyova, for a walk in the park. She was wary enough to leave a note for her son with Pechushkin's name and phone number, telling the boy to contact police if she did not return. When she vanished, the note led investigators straight to him. Surveillance footage from the metro showed the two of them together. Confronted with the evidence, Pechushkin confessed. He then began describing murder after murder in precise detail, leading police through Bitsa Park to the locations where he had dumped bodies. He reenacted the crimes on camera as part of the Russian investigative process. In his apartment, officers found a chessboard with dates marked on many of the squares, along with a notebook in which he had logged killings. At trial in 2007, Pechushkin was housed in a glass cage for security. He showed little emotion as the evidence was presented. He was convicted of 49 murders and 3 attempted murders. He asked the court to add further victims he claimed to have killed, bringing his personal total closer to 60, but prosecutors could only prove the 49. On October 29, 2007 he was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the first 15 years to be spent in solitary confinement. He has remained in the Russian prison system ever since, at one point held in the remote Arctic polar owl colony. In interviews and in court, Pechushkin described murder as essential to his existence. "For me, a life without murder is like a life without food for you," he said. "I felt like the father of all these people, since it was I who opened the door for them to another world." He claimed he would never have stopped on his own. The chessboard goal, he sometimes said, was real. At other times he suggested he would simply have continued indefinitely or moved on to a larger board. What is established is that for years he walked the same paths in Bitsa Park, offered the same bottle of vodka, and delivered the same crushing blows to the backs of skulls, while the city around him barely noticed the quiet accumulation of the dead. The men and the few women he killed were, in many cases, people already living on the margins. Pechushkin made certain they disappeared completely, until one co-worker's precautionary note finally placed a name and a face on the man who had been emptying the park of lives, one square at a time. Number 10. Dennis Rader, BTK***. For 31 years the people of Wichita, Kansas, lived with a name that arrived in the mail and on the evening news, BTK. What? Torture. Kill. The man who chose those words for himself broke into homes, bound his victims with ropes and pantyhose and telephone cord, and strangled them while they struggled. He left semen at scenes. He took souvenirs, underwear, jewelry, driver's licenses. He photographed some of the bodies. He wrote detailed journals describing the projects. And for decades he remained invisible because the same man who did those things also served as president of his Lutheran church congregation, led a Cub Scout troop, held a steady municipal job, and went home every night to a wife and 2 children who had no idea. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, the oldest of 4 boys. The family moved to the Wichita area when he was young. Outwardly he was unremarkable, Boy Scouts, church, ordinary jobs. Inside, by his own later admission, he developed intense fantasies of bondage and control from childhood. He later said he killed animals as a boy. After high school he served in the United States Air Force from 1966 to 1970, working as a communications specialist and reaching the rank of staff sergeant. He returned to Kansas, married Paula Dietz in 1971, and began a series of factory and assembly jobs, including work at the Coleman Company. In the early 1990s he became a compliance officer for Park City, essentially a bylaws enforcer who wrote tickets for overgrown lawns and loose dogs. Neighbors knew him as strict, punctual, and faintly authoritarian. At Christ Lutheran Church he rose to congregation president. The double life was complete. The first murders occurred on the morning of January 15, 1974. Rader had been stalking Julie Otero, a former co-worker at Coleman, and her 11-year-old daughter Josephine. He cut the phone line, entered the Otero home on East Wichita's North Edgemore Street, and confronted Joseph Otero Sr., Julie, 9-year-old Joseph Jr., and Josephine. He held them at gunpoint, ordered them to bind one another, and then systematically killed them. He suffocated Joseph Sr. and Joseph Jr. with plastic bags. He strangled Julie with a rope while the children were present. He took Josephine to the basement, hung her from a sewer pipe with a rope, and masturbated as she died. He cleaned the scenes, took a watch and a radio as souvenirs, and left. The 3 older Otero children discovered the bodies when they returned from school. Semen was recovered at the scene, evidence that would eventually help convict him more than 30 years later. 3 months later, on April 4, 1974, Rader broke into the home of another former Coleman employee, 21-year-old Catherine Bright. When Catherine and her brother Kevin returned, Rader was waiting with a gun. Both siblings fought. Rader shot Kevin in the head. Kevin survived and staggered away for help. Rader stabbed Catherine repeatedly. She died in the hospital. The attack was messier than the Otero killings and left a living witness, but Rader was not identified. He went quiet for nearly 3 years. Then, on March 17, 1977, he forced his way into the home of 26-year-old Shirley Vian after one of her young children opened the door. He locked the 3 children in the bathroom, barricaded the door, and strangled their mother. The children eventually escaped and gave police a vague description of a man in a black thing. In December of the same year he entered the home of 25-year-old Nancy Fox, bound her, and strangled her with a belt. Afterward he walked to a pay phone and calmly reported the homicide to a 911 dispatcher, giving the address. The voice was recorded. He later sent a letter to a local television station complaining that the media was not giving him enough attention and coining the BTK moniker in print. The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK. After 1977 the killings paused for 8 years. Rader later said the demands of work and family, and the risk of capture, kept him from acting. In April 1985 he broke his silence by murdering a neighbor, 53-year-old Maureen Hedge. He strangled her in her home, then took her body to the church where he served and photographed her in bondage positions before dumping the body. The following year, on September 16, 1986, he posed as a telephone repairman, gained entry to the home of 28-year-old Vicki Wegerle, and strangled her with pantyhose while her 2-year-old son was in the house. Her husband discovered the body and became the primary suspect for years. Rader's final known murder occurred on January 19, 1991. He broke into the secluded home of 62-year-old Dolores Davis, strangled her with pantyhose, and dumped her body under a bridge. Throughout the years of active killing and the long silences that followed, Rader documented everything. He kept journals describing the stalking, the hit kits of rope and bags and tape, the sexual satisfaction he derived from the control and the deaths. He took Polaroid photographs of some victims. He collected trophies. He called the crimes projects, and assigned them code names. The public face never cracked. He raised his children, attended church, enforced city ordinances, and lived in the same community where the bodies had been found. By the early 2000s the BTK case was cold. Then in 2004, a newspaper article about the unsolved murders prompted Rader to resume contact. He sent a letter to the Wichita Eagle containing a photocopy of Vicki Wegerle's driver's license and photographs of her body, proving he was the killer. Further packages followed. In one communication he asked police whether a floppy disk could be traced to a computer and instructed them to place a classified ad if the answer was no. Investigators ran the ad, "Rex, it will be okay." Rader sent the disk. Metadata recovered from the disk showed it had been used on a computer at Christ Lutheran Church and that the last user was named Dennis. The congregation president was Dennis Rader. A black Jeep Cherokee matching one seen on surveillance near a package drop-off was registered to him. Investigators obtained a familial DNA sample from his daughter's medical records. It matched semen left at the Otero scene. On February 25, 2005, police arrested Rader as he drove home for lunch. In custody he confessed in exhaustive, unemotional detail to all 10 murders. He expressed irritation that the police had lied to him about the floppy disk. "The floppy did me in," he said. On June 27, 2005, he pleaded guilty. On August 18, 2005, he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, effectively 175 years, with no possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. The families of the Oteros, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicki Wegerle, and Dolores Davis were left with the knowledge that the man who destroyed their lives had sat in the same pews, walked the same streets, and enforced the same petty regulations as any other citizen. Dennis Rader's long freedom rested on the gap between the ordinary surface he maintained and the private rituals of binding, photographing, and strangling that he recorded in journals no one was meant to read. When the need for recognition finally overcame the need for secrecy, a single digital file, metadata he did not understand, ended the longest unsolved serial murder investigation in Wichita's history. The name he chose for himself is now inseparable from the 10 people whose lives he took, and from the decades in which a church-going compliance officer walked free among them.